Yes. So today we're going to be talking about butterflies, and we're going to start with our usual introduction, but then we're also going to review the semester. And then we'll talk about the origins and the anatomy of butterflies. We'll talk about metamorphosis or their life cycle. We'll talk about helping butterflies, and then we'll do our activities and go over some resources that you can visit. So to start out for our intro and review, everyone is joined. You guys know that this is me. I'm Megan. I'm Aiden and Lizzie's mom still. And we have done so many classes, you guys, including today. We have done 23 sessions all together. And I know a lot of you have joined almost all of those sessions. So good job, you guys. These are all of the topics that we covered, starting with all about viruses and all the way to butterflies today. And I started recording these after the first session. So starting with the elephant seals, I started recording and I made a YouTube channel for them so that if you guys missed anything or you want to revisit any of the classes, I'll make sure you have the link to this, but you can see all of the classes are on here on my videos. And I usually record it from the time we start talking until towards the end. So it cuts out a few things like the homework assignments and things like that, but you guys can see everything else. If there's anything you missed or anything you still want to learn about, go ahead and check those out. And then I wanted to show this off.
Megan.
Yes.
That Common and me have joined all the classes less one that we needed to watch because it was too late.
Oh yeah, I remember that actually. I had to move the class. So yeah, if you guys want to check that out, you can look on this channel and see anything that you missed. So I wanted to highlight this because you guys have done so much homework and so many activities. I've gotten at least 126 homework assignments, just counting up the individuals on here, but a lot of times you guys did more than one, so it's probably closer to like 150. So I wanted to call out Inez, Rhea, Carmen, Amaya, and Oliver Sav because you guys did so much work. And I'm very, very proud of all of you. So especially Inez, Rhea, and Carmen, you guys did a ton of assignments, and it's very, very impressive. So I'm going to keep way better track of this for the summer session. And because I had to do a lot of work to put this together last night, it would be easier just to do it as I go. So I'll do a better job keeping track moving forward, but I've been really impressed by all of you guys, and I've loved seeing your assignments every week. Okay, so what's going to happen next? So next we're going to take a short break before the summer session starts. So I'm going to take a break to drive Aiden and Lizzie partway home and then get some work stuff done. And we should be starting again in about 2 weeks. And when we do that, we're going to actually switch what we use to talk. So right now we're on Zoom, and we're going to switch to using my Work Ring Central account. And it's almost exactly the same as Zoom. So you guys will have an easy time using it, but you might have to download a new program. So sorry about that. We're also going to continue doing homework if you guys are interested in still doing that. And for attendees, if you have friends that might want to join this summer, please feel free to let them know. Or if you don't want to come to the summer session, that's fine too. All you have to do is let me know and I'll stop emailing your parents. Okay? Cool. So now we're going to start talking about our topic for today, which is butterflies. So who remembers who this guy is? Olivia?
Charles Darwin.
Yes, exactly. So I've showed this picture to you guys before because he was an English naturalist who described the theory of evolution in his book on the origin of species. And so his theory was that no two animals are the same, even if they're the same species, and that animals and plants have little tiny changes over long periods of time. And we can't see those with our bare eyes or in our lifetime, but when they add up over super, super long periods of time, they can lead to whole new species. And so I've showed you this slide before too. Remember the tree of life branching out. And today we're going to be talking about someone over here in the insects. So we're going to talk about butterflies. And butterflies are actually considered animals. So they're in the kingdom of Animalia, but then they're in the class Insecta. So they're insects, which means they have 6 legs and 3 body segments. And then their order is called Lepidoptera. So that might be one that sounds kind of familiar to you guys. Their suborder Rhopalocera, I think is how you say it, but I'm not really sure. That one seems really hard. But I've heard Lepidoptera a lot before, and that's really common because Lepidoptera includes butterflies and moths. So a lot of times people like to study or collect both. So that's a kind of more common name for them. But you can see here that they're pretty closely related to flies, and then branching out to ants and bees and wasps, if you remember the Hymenoptera from when we did the bees class. And then it kind of goes back into beetles and bugs and other things. So butterflies are defined by a few different characteristics, and characteristics just mean something about a species that you can use to kind of classify them or know that they kind of count towards or belong in a group. And so one of the things about butterfly adults is that they have 4 wings. So we kind of think of them a lot of times as having 2 wings, but they actually have 4. So there's kind of a top wing on one side and a bottom wing, and then it's mirrored on the other side. So basically, if you kind of divide a butterfly in half, it's
Symmetrical.
symmetrical. Thank you. Yeah, it's the same on both sides. So there are 4 wings, and those wings are actually covered with scales. So almost like scales on a fish, but they're what gives the butterfly their color. And so you can see,
Megan,
yes.
Nana slept over last night.
Yeah. Cool. McKenna, did you have a question?
Don't like you?
It was like,
I got a new fish.
You did.
I got a koi beta.
That's very cool. That's exciting.
My dad told me they were rare, and I think my beta's nesting babies.
Oh, cool. So fish have scales, and we always think of fish having scales, right? That's pretty common for us to think about, or maybe snakes. But a lot of people don't think about butterflies having scales, but they actually do. So this isn't a smooth surface necessarily. It's all little bits and pieces of scales. And there are pigments or colors that are in those scales that give the pattern and the color to a butterfly as a whole. And one of the coolest part about the scales is that they have microstructure, which just means little tiny structures in them with the scales and the hairs that can make them iridescent. And iridescent means that when you turn it different ways, it shows different colors. So there's a good example of that right there. So another thing that defines butterflies is that they, like all insects, have their body divided into 3 sections: the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. And you'll also notice that each of those parts, or each of those 3 leg sets, are connected to the thorax. So also in most families of butterflies, their antennae that come off the top of their head are clubbed, which means they have kind of a bigger piece at the end, or a bigger bump at the end. So this picture is a kind of close-up drawing of different kinds of butterfly antennae, and you can see that they're bigger on the ends. And so a lot of times if you draw butterflies, you might know that when you draw their antenna, we a lot of times put a little circle at the tip, and that's because their antennae are clubbed. And unlike moths, moths usually have kind of feathery antennae, but the butterflies are just kind of one piece, usually with the club at the end. And then they also have a long proboscis. Does anybody know what a proboscis is?
There's a thing called a proboscis monkey.
There is. So in this case, the proboscis is their long mouthpiece that curls up. And so they can coil that when they're not using it, but it comes out from their mouth, and they can coil it back in, probably into a golden spiral.
like a really long tongue.
Yeah, almost like that. It's kind of like a special butterfly straw that they use to sip nectar.
Mm-hmm.
So another thing that identifies butterflies is they're diurnal. And diurnal means that they have a pattern of activity, or when they're awake and they're asleep, that occurs every 24 hours, so once a day. So we are also diurnal, and butterflies are active during the daytime. So when do you guys usually see moths out and about? Does anybody know? McKenna?
At night.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Olivia. Yeah, at night. So we usually see moths at night, but we usually see butterflies during the day. And that's because they have different patterns of activity. And they also have pretty bright colors about them. And does anybody know what they have in common in these two pictures about their wings? Not the pattern necessarily. Olivia?
Their bodies kind of match the wings.
Yeah, they do. But in this case, their wings are folded up together from their body. So when they're resting and they're hanging out on plants, they usually fold up their wings together. And moths usually have their wings out when they're resting. So that's one of the ways you can usually tell the difference between moths and butterflies is the way they hold their wings and then when you see them outside. But there are exceptions to that. There's something that I've seen before, which is really cool, called a hummingbird hawk moth. And I actually at first thought it was a hummingbird because its wings were moving so fast and it was eating from flowers. But it's actually a moth and it comes out in the daytime just like a hummingbird. So it's not a hard and fast rule.
This was like, Brandon.
Meaning it doesn't apply all the time. So another thing about butterfly is that their larvae or their caterpillars have hard heads. So their heads are sclerotized, and they have really strong mandibles or mouth parts that they use for cutting their food. And their food is usually leaves. So I like this picture over here because it shows their mandibles chomping on some leaves. So mandibles is just a word for their mouth parts. But they also have a cylindrical body, which means it's long and tube-shaped, and it's divided into 10 segments for the abdomen itself. And then they have short, even though it seems like caterpillars have tons and tons of legs, and insects are only supposed to have 3 pairs, they actually only have 3 pairs of real legs, and the other ones are pro-legs, which means they're not really legs, they're just kind of body parts that are used like legs. So that is kind of what defines butterflies, but there's another thing that they do that you guys probably want to know more about. And I saw McKenna holding up a good example of this. It's their life cycle. So butterflies' life cycles, very cool. Very cool. So butterfly life cycles, like we talked about with plants, go in a circle. So cycle means circle. And they go from adult to egg to larva or caterpillar to pupa and then back to an adult and then they lay eggs and it just keeps going around and around and around. So the format we're probably most used to seeing is the adult. So here's an example of some adult butterflies. And in this stage, they can live for as short as a week or they can live up to a year. And that really depends on what kind of butterfly they are. But a lot of times they have kind of a long stage as larvae and they can also remain dormant or kind of sleeping for a little while where they're not really doing anything.
In their cocoon?
Yeah, sort of. So some of them do have a cocoon, but some don't, and I'll explain that a little bit. But as adults, then they usually find other, they release pheromones, which are, if you guys remember, I've talked about that a little bit before with like cats and dogs like rubbing their faces on things and smelling pheromones. They're like smelly kind of signals that they use to communicate with other butterflies so that they know that it's time to lay eggs. So when they lay the eggs, I thought this was really crazy. The eggs are protected by a hard ridged outer layer of kind of a shell. And it's not like a chicken egg shell, but it's still protective. And then that has a thin coating of wax inside. And that's what keeps the egg from drying out. Because things like amphibians or frogs, when they lay their eggs, or fish, they lay them in the water, right? So we don't have to worry about them drying out from the sun or the air. But butterflies do have to worry about that. So there's wax inside their eggs. And each egg has one baby butterfly in the inside, and they can vary a lot, or there's a lot of differences between butterfly eggs. So some are very, very small, some are bigger, some are different shapes, which you can see here. This one looks kind of like a little star. It almost looks like someone piped frosting on the bottom of this leaf. So all the eggs look really different. But one of the coolest things is that females can usually produce between 100 and 200 eggs. So
that's a lot of brothers and sisters.
Isn't it? Yeah, that's quite a bit. I'm glad I don't have 100 or 200 brothers and sisters. So then the eggs are fixed or kind of glued to the leaf with a special glue, and it hardens really quickly so that the egg sticks to the leaf. And as it hardens, it kind of contracts or shrinks a little bit and changes the shape of the egg slightly. So we can, if we look really closely at these, in real life, you could actually see the glue that's holding them to the leaf. And also, eggs are almost always laid on plants. Each species of butterfly might lay their egg on a different kind of plant, but they almost always lay them on plants in general. And the eggs, this stage, will usually last for a couple weeks in most species, but sometimes if they lay them towards the winter, they might overwinter in the egg, but usually it's not super, super long. So those eggs actually are very, very small. So those pictures I showed you before are zoomed in really close. So I wanted to show you this picture because this little egg next to this person's, a grown person's thumb, is a monarch egg. So you can see just how teeny tiny they are. And we have to zoom in really close on them to see the really cool structures that they have. So once they emerge from those eggs, they look kind of gross. They don't look like what we think of as a caterpillar, right? Yeah, they're larvae. So butterfly larvae or caterpillars, they come out of the egg and then they start eating. Does anybody remember that book, The Very Hungry Caterpillar? He starts eating and eating and growing and eating and
He got it, yeah.
And then he ate everything.
Yeah, and then he ate everything. So that's really what caterpillars are doing. They're chomping through all of the plants they can find. And they spend almost all of their time as caterpillars looking for or eating food. And there's a few species that actually will eat other insects, but or like ant larvae, but most of them just eat plants. And so as they're maturing, they go from these funny little guys like this through different stages to become kind of more of a grown-up caterpillar. And we call these stages of larvae instars, which is a little bit of a funny word. But those instars, at the end of each of the stage, they undergo a process where some hormones are released and their outer skin gets really tough. And once it gets tough, it splits open and then they emerge. So it's almost like molting, like when you see like a crab or something molt into a bigger shell. It's kind of like that in a way, because that new or that old skin is almost shell-like at that point, which is pretty cool. So that old cuticle, or the hard part, splits open and the new bigger caterpillar comes out, and then they eat and eat and eat, and then they go through the same process again. So once they do that and they've gotten into the biggest stage of caterpillar, they decide that they're ready to become a pupa. So when the larva is fully grown, it gets more hormone signals or chemical signals in its body, and it stops eating. So it's been eating and growing and growing and growing, and then all of a sudden it stops eating and it starts doing something called wandering. And it just is basically looking around for a safe place to stop and rest. And so when it stops and rests, it's called a pupation site, and it becomes a pupa. And what it does then is it spins a little tiny bit of silk, and it uses that to fasten its body to the bottom of its pupation site. So you can see here, this monarch caterpillar has a little tiny white spot here, and that's the silk that it spun. So most of the time, the caterpillars are a naked pupa, or they turn into this hard part called a chrysalis. But sometimes they'll spin a lot of silk, and then that's a cocoon. So technically monarch butterflies are in a chrysalis. Most moths, I think, are in cocoons, but sometimes we use those words to mean the same thing, but they're actually kind of different. So cocoon is spun of silk, and a chrysalis is just part of the larva's body, or the pupa's body. So as you can see here, they're curling up their body, and then they're it's getting covered with this chrysalis, and it finally gets covered completely. And then it goes through several different stages, and there's a lot of different kinds of pupae or chrysalis. They all look different depending on the species. So just like the eggs and the grown-ups look different, they look different when they're pupating. And you can see a couple really cool examples here. Sometimes they even look like they're made of metal, or they're gold. And I think these are very, very pretty. So as they're all developing, they're doing all of this work inside, but something crazy is happening inside that chrysalis. And that is that most of the tissues and the cells that make up that caterpillar that went in there are all broken down and digested. So inside the chrysalis, the caterpillar's body is digesting itself, and it's using the same juices it used to digest its food to digest its own body. And the fluid breaks down the old caterpillar body into cells that are called imaginal cells, and that means that they can become any type of cell. So it basically is digesting its body into just liquidy goo, and that goo can become anything, and then it rebuilds its whole body into an adult butterfly. Can you imagine that? It's like almost like it went into a blender and it turns into goo, and then it somehow reforms, which is really amazing that all of those cells kind of know what to do. And once it reforms, it starts to emerge from the chrysalis. So this is probably what McKenna is waiting for her butterflies to do, I would guess, because towards the end, especially for monarchs, the chrysalis turns clear or transparent. And then you can start to see the adult butterfly inside. So that ball of goo that was a caterpillar and turned into mush has now turned into an adult butterfly with working legs and wings and proboscis. And it will emerge from this chrysalis. And then it'll oftentimes hang upside down for quite a while, flapping its wings and kind of spreading them out, because see, it was really crunched up and squished inside that chrysalis. And now that it's coming out, it needs to let its wings fluff out. It needs to get all of the hydraulic, like the fluids and things that go in that wing to help it move, all need to spread out. And then it kind of needs to dry as well. So a lot of times they'll emerge and then they'll hang there for quite a while while they're getting ready before they take their first flight. And they'll do some practice flaps too, to kind of get things moving. It's almost like if you were stretching out and getting ready, and doing some jumping jacks before you decided to go for a run. And one of the coolest things is that whole process is called metamorphosis. So this is a word and a concept that people really like, the idea of being able to change into something completely different. But what metamorphosis actually means is the process of changing from an immature form or a baby to an adult in 2 or more distinct stages. Okay, so we got to go through the rest quickly because we're losing time here. Sorry, I got really excited about butterflies and wanted to talk.
Megan, does the same process happen with the moths?
Yes, same process with the moths, except for they tend to spin a silk cocoon. So one of the things, oh, go ahead.
For being a butterfly, you need to be a different type of caterpillar.
Yes, so all the caterpillar types are different depending on the species of butterfly or moth.
Okay.
McKenna.
Go ahead.
For the yellow one, it has like the spiral on the bottom wing.
Yeah, it does. It has a golden spiral. That's really cool. So these I wanted to show you because there's a lot of endangered species of butterflies, which you might not even think of. We think of endangered species being things like panda bears and tigers and big things, but there's actually a lot of insects and amphibians and other sorts of small things that we don't think about in our daily lives that are critically endangered, meaning there aren't very many left. And one of the main causes of that is habitat destruction. So they're losing places to live and they're losing places to reproduce and make more butterflies. Another issue is collecting. So people love beautiful butterflies, and if you've ever been to a natural history museum and maybe seen the big frames where the bugs have the pins through them, collecting insects used to be a very, very popular hobby, and so lots and lots of people were out collecting them, especially for this blue morpho butterfly. And now it's endangered, partially because of that and partially because of habitat destruction. Does anybody know what this butterfly is?
The monarch butterfly.
Yes. So this is a monarch butterfly, and monarchs are also endangered. So these are native to North America, and they actually migrate for really long distances. I think this is absolutely crazy. So they fly an average of 22 miles a day for about 85 days, and they fly during the daytime. And they go from overwintering places which are usually in Mexico, or sometimes on the coast of California, and then they fly super long ways to where they hang out in the spring and summer. And the whole population will move, and so it's this mass migration where you can see tons of butterflies flying everywhere, which is pretty cool. But one of the issues we've been seeing is that they're not taking up as much space in the place where they overwinter. So where they usually are resting during the winter in Mexico, you can see they used to take up tons and tons of space. And now it's really going pretty steadily down. And the space that they take up is directly related to how many butterflies there actually are, right? Because they're usually kind of packed together pretty densely. So if they're not taking up a lot of area, it means there's less butterflies. And we've been able to show that their population is also declining. So you can see it does kind of go up and down a little bit, but mostly it's declining and going down, which wasn't great. And a lot of that is because of the habitat loss and also fragmentation. So fragmentation means the chunks of habitat that they had, instead of being one big whole group where they can migrate through, they're now in a bunch of little different spots. And so they have to it's like if you had to jump across a river using rocks, it's much more difficult for them to migrate if they don't have one long stream or bridge to get where they're going. And pesticide use has also hurt monarchs. So pesticide kills certain kinds of plants. And one of the things that monarchs eat is called milkweed. And milkweed is considered a weed by most people, and so pesticides kill it off. And then finally, changing climates and global warming has also kind of hurt monarchs. So now I'm going to tell you guys how you can help the monarch if you're interested.
How does global warming hurt them?
It hurts them because when the temperatures are changing and they can either get too hot or too cold, it affects their reproduction and also their flying and their food sources.
Yeah, my favorite butterflies.
Yeah, they're beautiful. So if you guys want to help, you can do what's called citizen science. So citizen science is science that anybody can do. So if you guys see monarchs out and about and they have one of these tags on them, go ahead and take a picture of the tag and call the number, or go to the website and put in the code so that they can see where the monarchs are going. You can also create habitat for monarchs. So you can plant a pollinator garden, just like we talked about with bees before. And it can be anywhere. It can be your yard. It could be at school. You could talk to your class about doing it. It could be at your church or at your parents' business, or even in just a pot on the front steps. Anywhere you want to put pollinator plants is great. And the most important one for monarchs.
What are pollinator plants? One of our neighbors who lives like a couple blocks away, they have a pollinator habitat in their front yard, and it has that sign. What's a pollinator habitat?
A pollinator habitat just means that it supports animals that spread pollen from different plants to the others. So like bees and hummingbirds and butterflies, because pollination, if you remember from the bee class, is really important for agriculture and for plant reproduction. So it's just, go ahead.
We've got a lot of plants, and our garden is quite full of bees, and I think there's a bee nest.
That's wonderful. Yeah. So if you plant things specifically like this milkweed, I don't think you have monarchs in Spain necessarily, but for over here, you can plant milkweed to attract the monarchs. And then in Spain, you guys also might have some endangered butterflies, and you can look up their favorite plants to chomp on. Okay, so real quick, we're going to go through activities. So for little kids, you can draw me a butterfly. You can find a butterfly outside and tell me about it or draw it, or you can draw out the butterfly life cycle. Big kids can draw and label a butterfly. You can write a couple sentences about endangered butterflies and how you can help them, or you can plant milkweed or other pollinator plants with your parents' permission and help. And middle schoolers, you guys can make a comic about metamorphosis. You can write a paragraph about what defines butterflies, or you can plant milkweed or other pollinator plants and create a butterfly habitat in your yard with your parents' help and permission. And obviously, you guys email your homework to me, and then there's lots of resources for you guys here. If you want to specifically know about how to help monarchs, you can go down here to the Save the Monarch link, and that's from the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, I think, and it talks a lot about what you can do to help them.